Hi, my name is Kelp, and this is The Lion of Poetry. The theme for today is poetry throughout your life. And the two poets that I'd like to focus on are the American poet, E. E. Cummings, and the British poet, Philip Larkin. Now for me, E. E. Cummings is the poet of childhood. First of all, because I first experienced E. E. Cummings in my childhood. He was probably the first real poet that I was exposed to as a child. E. E. Cummings also embodied the spirit of the 1960s, the era that I grew up in. He was a champion of freedom, love, nonconformism. His poems often conveyed an anti-war message. He was in general anti-establishment. One need only look at his nonconformist writing style, with no respect for the basic rules of grammar and capitalization. His own name is famously written in lowercase letters. And the shape of his poems also don't conform to accepted norms. The indentations, the spacing, there are literally no margins. His words seem to be free of constraints. So we have this freedom, this sense of innocence and joy which pervades his poetry. Let's consider the poem In Just Spring, which, by the way, I used to read to my daughter when she was a young girl. It's her favorite poem.
In just spring, when the world is mud luscious, the little lame balloon man whistles far and wee. And Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring, when the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee. And Betty and Isabel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring. And the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee.
The poem is about the joy of spring and the playfulness of spring. The weather is warmer, children are outside playing, Eddie and Bill and Betty and Isabel. The poet ties these names together as if they're one name, as if these friends are indeed joined at the hip, inseparable, as best friends are. The boys are playing boys' games, marbles and piracies, and the girls are playing hopscotch and jump rope. Notwithstanding that this poem might not hold up so well in our current times with regard to gender stereotypes, as well as the use of terms like lame, still, we feel the joy in this poem. And the whistling balloon man also seems to be the harbinger of spring. It seems perhaps that he only comes out with his balloons in the spring. And the fact that he is goat-footed suggests that he's a kind of mythical, pastoral figure, part man, part animal. And the whistling is a kind of basic, simple expression of joy. And the use of the phrase far and wee is like baby language. It reinforces the innocence of the poem. Notice as well how Cummings invents words like puddle wonderful, which also shows his playfulness with language. The next poem by Cummings, Buffalo Bill, presents a simple, childish view of death. The poem is about a real person. Buffalo Bill Cody was a famous cowboy, soldier, and showman. He would travel from town to town doing carnival shows and playing on the mythology of the Wild West. He would show off his marksmanship, as in shooting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. And his horsemanship, as in riding a water-smooth silver stallion. How is it possible, asks the poet, that a person like Buffalo Bill, so full of charisma, so full of talent and ability, so full of life, how is it possible for this perfect specimen of humanity to die? The poem personifies death, calls him Mr. Death, and asks, how do you like your blue-eyed boy? How can you take such a man? And the word defunct early in the poem is also very telling. It's a strange, awkward word for death. It shows how awkward and uncomfortable the poet is with death. Like a child, the poet finds the whole idea beyond comprehension. Death should not have power and sway over individuals like Buffalo Bill, who are so full of life.
Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a water-smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death?
Our final E. E. Cummings poem is I Thank You, God, for Most This Amazing. There's again a simple, almost childlike sense of gratitude and joy and humility in this poem. In many of Cummings' poems, he uses irony, but I don't think he's being ironic here. I think he is truly trying to show gratitude and appreciation to God. And the appreciation is an appreciation of God's gift of nature, the leaping green spirits of trees and the blue true dream of sky.
I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I, who have died, am alive again today, and this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life and of love and wings and of the gay, great happening, illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing any lifted from the know of all nothing human merely being doubt unimaginable you? Now the ears of my ears awake, and now the eyes of my eyes are opened.
Most of Cummings' poems use free verse, but this poem is actually a sonnet. It's 14 lines and has more or less the typical sonnet rhyme scheme. In the first stanza, looking at the last words in each line, we have day as a near rhyme with sky, and trees as a near rhyme with yes. In the second stanza, the rhymes are more exact. Today rhymes with gay, and birth with earth. The third stanza, we have seeing and being, and know as a near rhyme with you. Finally ending with a kind of rhyming couplet, and near rhymes with opend. Cummings also uses parentheses in his poem in interesting ways to create a kind of poem within a poem. He does this twice in this poem. Just as E. E. Cummings is a poet for and about youth, Philip Larkin is a poet for and about adults. One needs the perspective of adulthood to appreciate his poetry. One of the best examples of this is the poem Toads. The brilliant metaphor, the central conceit of this poem is the idea that work is like a toad. It's a toad squatting on your life, not very attractive, not very appealing, crushing all the energy out of your life.
Toads. Why should I let the toad work, squat on my life? Can't I use my wit as a pitchfork and drive the brute off? 6 days of the week it soils with its sickening poison, just for paying a few bills. That's out of proportion. Lots of folk live on their wits. Lecturers, lispers, losels, loblolly men, louts. They don't end as paupers. Lots of folk live up lanes with fires in a bucket, eat windfalls and tin sardines. They seem to like it. Their nippers have got bare feet, their unspeakable wives are skinny as whippets, and yet no one actually starves. Were I courageous enough to shout, stuff your pension, but I know all too well that's the stuff that dreams are made on. For something sufficiently toad-like squats in me too. Its hunkers are heavy as hard luck and cold as snow, and will never allow me to blarney my way to getting the fame and the girl and the money, all at one sitting. I don't say one body's the other one's spiritual truth, but I do say it's hard to lose either when you have both.
Whereas Cummings wrote mostly in free verse, Larkin's poems almost all rhyme and follow traditional meter. For example, in the first stanza we have work in a close near rhyme with pitchfork. But then we have life and off near rhyme. This continues throughout the poem. In the next stanza we have soils and bills and poison and proportion near rhymes. These near rhymes have a certain beauty and inventiveness unto themselves. There are 9 stanzas in this poem, each one 4 lines, or as we call it, a quatrain. In the first stanza, he introduces the idea of the toad work, squatting on his life. Why can't he use his wit to drive off the brute? and the brute here is the toad. In other words, why can't he live on his wits instead of having to bear the drudgery and boredom of a 9-to-5 job? Larkin, by the way, worked in a library. He was a librarian. In the next stanza, the poet opines that he works 6 days a week. Continuing the toad imagery, this toad called work is not just ugly and imposing, but it seems to be a poisonous toad, or the kind of toad that soils, makes you dirty, maybe gives you warts. And all of this just to pay a few bills. The job isn't making him rich. It's just paying the bills. And yet he gives over 6/7 of his life. It seems to be out of proportion. He's giving too much and not getting back very much. Then he says, lots of folk live on their wits. They are appreciated for their cleverness, not for the hours that they put in or the drudgery. Then he lists examples of these people who live on their wits. None of them seem to be very respectable in the poet's eyes. There's a bit of humor and playfulness in the odd list of professions. Larkin makes use of alliteration. They all begin with the letter L. Lecturers, people who give lectures for a living. Speakers, panelists, lispers. Lisping for the poet shows a kind of affectation, an artificial way of talking. Then lousels, loblolly men, and louts are all scoundrels of a type, worthless people in the poet's eyes, ne'er-do-wells. They all seem to survive. None end as paupers, none are poor. Then we have folk that live up the lanes with fires in a bucket. It's an image of tramps or homeless people warming their hands by campfires in a trash can. Their meals are modest, windfalls, which may be food left for them by strangers, or canned sardines. Not a very appealing lifestyle, one would think. But the poet considers whether it's not so bad after all, and possibly better than the hell of being chained to a job that you don't like. Their nippers, meaning their children, go barefooted. They can't afford shoes for them, and their wives are skinny as whippets. Whippets are a kind of skinny dog, like a greyhound. They're poor, these people, but they don't starve. They get by, and they seem to have the kind of freedom that the poet envies. The poet wishes that he had the courage to quit his job, to say, stuff your pension. But he can't. Pensions are considered sort of like golden handcuffs. They keep a person in their job, and he's recognizing this fact. So he can't say, stuff your pension. The pension has a certain appeal, the dream of a comfortable retirement, perhaps. And then he confesses, there's something sufficiently toad-like that is squatting in him as well. This is in addition to the toad that squats on him, on his life, from the first stanza. Let's call it an external toad. Now he says there's also an internal toad. Remember, the poem is called Toads in the plural. So we have the toad that is work, squatting on him from the outside, and another toad that may be called fear, or lack of courage, or inability to take risks. That's inside him. It's hunkered down inside him. And notice again the alliteration with the repetition of the H. Its hunkers are heavy as hard luck. And this internal toad will never let him blarney his way to success. A blarney is an Irish term, as in the Blarney Stone. It means to talk cleverly. In other words, to use his wits. He feels he doesn't have the ability or the courage to talk his way to getting the fame and women and money, all the things he desires. He doesn't feel that he has that level of charisma. Which takes us to the final stanza, a bit harder to decipher. But I think when he says one bodies the other one's spiritual truth, he's talking about these two toads, that between his internal sense of inadequacy and the external pressure of the job that he dislikes, it's hard to lose either when you have both. And here I think lose means to get rid of, like I'm trying to lose that. It's hard to get rid of the job, the external toad, when you have this sense of inadequacy, the internal toad. And hard to get rid of the sense of inadequacy when you have a horrid job. Hard to lose either when you have both. I really love this poem, but it's a poem that I never could have appreciated when I was a kid or even when I was a student at university. It takes becoming an adult to appreciate the poem Toads. In summary, different poems affect us and have significance for us at different stages in our lives. Some speak to us when we're younger and present the world from the perspective of youth. And some speak to us when we're older and more mature and more wizened by age. Poetry then follows us throughout life. Well, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time, which will be actually the last time on the Lion of Poetry.